Hi, welcome back to Learn Buffalo in Go. Today we're talking about forms. That's HTML forms. A couple things we want to keep in mind with our forms. We want to be able to encode and decode our structs, our models, into forms, and when the form is submitted, decode it out of the form and into a struct so we can save it to the database. Buffalo gives us some helpers so we don't have to build all of the pieces of the HTML form. And the last piece is we want some security, and we'll get that in the form of an authenticity token. If you've used a website framework before, this may be familiar, pretty common practice. Let's take a look at how all those pieces work together. So for starters, we can look at the Buffalo documentation. They do have a nice page on form. It goes into a lot of the details. One thing I'll point out right here at the top, there is a separate repo under the Go Buffalo namespace for this tags package. That's over here. If you click under form, you can see all the types of form element that we can create. Also, I'll point out this repo here is used by Buffalo. This is one of the pieces that helps encode your struct into a form and decode it when we send it back to the server. So if you have some questions, they might get answered here. Jumping back into our project, where did we leave off? We have some blogs. In the last one, we did show this form real briefly. Let's look in detail about how we have this simple form built. The first thing to look at might be how do we get to this form? The typical CRUD definition does not include a specific route for showing a form. We have some flexibility here. I'm using blog/new, and that points to this blogs create handler. Not much going on here. We create an empty blog, set it on the context, and return one of our templates. So there's 2 or 3 ways to make a form in Buffalo. The easy, the less easy, and the hard way. So the easy way is if we're mapping a struct directly into the form. And for that we can use this form for. It looks like a function here, right? It's a method. It takes 2 parameters. What is the form for? Where we would pass in a struct, in our case this blog model, and then we would pass it in some parameters. In this case, what is the action on the form? There are other options we can pass in here, but that should be enough for now. So what do we see inside of this block here? F.input tag, and we give that input tag a name. What is F? We jump over here to the documentation. There's a little bit of information about this. By default, the form value inside the block is given the name F. You could change the name of this variable if you wanted, but that's what F is. So for each of these, we are going to use a tag. And again, these are tags out of the Go Buffalo tags package. So we see here we're passing in 2 inputs, a simple text field, a text area, and we have a submit button here. Not a lot going on. The title here refers to the property on our blog, and Buffalo knows how to encode that for us. Body is the same thing. Body is a property on our blog. It does a lot of the work for us. So if we look at the structure of our form here, we can see what we're getting. So we get form ID blog form. The action is there. This is already inferred that we want to do a method post. Here's that authenticity token, and in each of these form groups is our inputs. For the title, we have a label and an input, the name, so that matches 1-to-1 with our blog model, and same down here. A couple extra things I did here. We are adding CK editor just so we have a little bit of formatting help. And what did that mean? We pass an ID. Rows is helpful for text area. CK editor is going to modify that when it runs, but you can see how that works. We could also pass a class in here, and you can see how you can add properties to our form elements this way. Okay, so that's the easy way. What if we wanted to do the less easy way? Okay, so the less easy way would look like this. If we comment out our form for and add this partial, here we have this partial. So instead of form for, we just do a form, and Buffalo doesn't know what the form is for. It lets us build it. We define the action and the method, And similarly, we can create our inputs. We need to pass some options in here, so we give the input a name, label. We can pass in some of those extra parameters like ID and rows. And what we get on the front end is pretty much the same thing. The form up here, it doesn't have an ID anymore. We could add that back. It has action, has method, has an authenticity token. It has our inputs. One thing we could change here is we don't need to load an empty blog model and pass it to the context anymore. If we remove that entirely, the form is just something we've manually built now. So the hard way to build a form in Buffalo would be to do it manually in the HTML. You get the idea. We would have to build each element. The only caveat is if you want to make your own forms is you will need to manage that authenticity token yourself. The Buffalo docs do have some pointers about how to do that. Okay, so if we step back to what we had before, form 4, restore our empty blog, we get the form we had originally. So we've created the form and now we have to submit the form. How does that work? That route is down here in our router, and again that's a post route to blogs, and this follows the CRUD patterns. So blogs create is our handler to the form. Blogs new is the handler that responds to the post request. So there's a lot going on here. We get the database connection from the context. We create an empty blog, and here is where the magic happens. Context has a bind method that tries to decode the form into a struct. And this is what that looks like. If we get an error, we can handle the error, and after that, we can move on with further processing. Here we do a little extra step only because our blogs need a user, and until we get a user login and things, we're just attaching a random user, the last user from our database. And down here is where we're going to do validate and create. So remember from our models section where we set some of these things up, we did define some validation steps. So VERS is the validation errors. If we have any errors, this is what that looks like. We could add a flash message, and then we need to pass the blog back to the form along with the errors. And we're going to render the form again, and we'll see how the errors are managed in this case. So title and body are required fields. What if we just submit the form? Okay, so this is what that looks like. So Buffalo has figured out how to attach the proper validation error message to the field, and we get that here. Let's see what happens if we leave the body blank. Okay, so we do get an error message down here. Body cannot be blank. And you see how that worked. We didn't lose the title because we passed the blog back to the template so we could render. If we satisfy all the requirements, the handler will process that data and save it to our database. Okay, so you may have noticed there's one thing missing from our blog form. There's no way to add tags. How would we do that? So let's take a look at a couple of options. One option would be to create maybe a select tag or a checkbox that allows users to select one of the existing tags. How would that work? So in our blog's create function, we could look up all the tags that exist and just pass them to the form. We can update the form with this select tag, and again we're mapping this to the field on the blog struct, and to give it the proper options, we do options and pass in that list of tags that we've created. What does that look like? Okay, so we have the title, the body, and down here we have blog tags. Okay, it is a select tag, but it's a mess. It's just the entire struct, the tag struct. So what happened here? If we go over here, the Buffalo docs do have some information on that. They have this notion of a selectable interface. The easy way to do this is we just need to create a couple of methods on the tag so that it knows what's the value and what's the label. So if we jump over to our tag model, okay, so if we add these methods to our tag struct in order to generate the proper label, which in this case is the name, and the value, which would be the ID, which is what the database knows the entity as. Reload. And now our form is starting to be more usable. Take a quick look. How do those options come through? So again, the UUID, the ID, is the value, and the food, the name, is what is displayed to the user. Okay, let's see what happens when we try to save this. Okay, so it looks like if we go back to our database logging, we only inserted a blog. So our handler is only trying to create the blog because we're calling validate and create on the blog. If you remember, we do have this eager method. So eager tries to create or load any related associations on the main model. So the children, the dependent fields on the blog in this case. The problem here is that we have a many-to-many relationship. So we don't want to attach the tag to the blog. We want to create a new blog tag association and add that to the blog. So the eager isn't going to work in this case. If we had a simple one-to-many relationship, we could do something like that. But here we're going to need to pull the tags out independently and add those to the blog. How do we do that? One thing to keep in mind is that Buffalo adds a lot of helpers for us, but it is Golang at its core. We can run simple functions like this in order to just parse a form manually. In this case, request is part of the Buffalo context, so we do it this way. Parse the form after we've loaded the blog, and we try to extract the blog tags element from the form. We're going to try to map that to a tag. We do that with a database lookup. Can we find this tag in our database? If not, we could print an error. If we do find it, now we can attach it to our blog this way. And now with the eager function, it should properly create both the blog tag and the blog for us. Let's take a look. Okay, so that seemed to report no errors. We do have this blog. It is tagged computers. See, it does show up in this list here, and that's exactly what we would expect. If you were paying attention closely, you may have realized we're using the blog tags field. We're actually passing tag structs. It would be more appropriate if we renamed this tags, and then down here it would be just tags. So what's another way we could add tags to our blogs? We could use text input where each comma separates the individual tags. So in our form, change this to an input. And in our controller for the form, we don't need any of this. And our page would have this, just an empty text field. So now we need to update the handler. Instead of looking for tags, we're looking for a string that might contain commas, just as before we parse the form, and we're looking for that tags form value. And now we have to split on the comma and assume that we're going to get a slice of strings back. We can make sure there's no extra spaces, and then we're going to look up that tag. And so here's where it gets tricky. The database query is going to return an error if it has a problem or if it doesn't find that record. In here we have to check what type of error we get back. Buffalo Pop wraps the SQL error. We have to do errors cause in order to actually read the type of error, in this case SQL error no rows. And that would just mean that the tag doesn't exist. We can create it now. So in either case, we're going to add that tag to the blog. And the rest of this proceeds as before. Let's see how that works. So we'll use a tag that already exists and maybe a new one. And we can see both of those tags are now attached to this blog. So that's a quick look at how to use forms, some of the form helpers, the tags in Buffalo. We looked at both the easy way, using the form for, as well as the form tag. And we also showed how you can just manually parse your form and pull the pieces out that you need. Sometimes you will need to do that if the helpers don't do what you need. One thing missing here is testing. There are some other form tags that we didn't get to, but maybe in a future episode. Stay tuned. Thanks.